The sun had not yet risen over Ouagadougou on October 15, 1987, when Thomas Sankara sat at his desk, penning notes for a speech he would never deliver. The faint glow of a kerosene lamp illuminated his face, a face etched with the weariness of a man who had traded sleep for the weight of a nation's hopes. Around him, the walls of his makeshift office bore no portraits of heroes or maps of empires, only a chalkboard scribbled with crop yields, vaccination targets, and the names of villages awaiting new wells. Sankara's revolution was built on these details, a mosaic of small, stubborn acts of defiance against the old ways of power. But as the clock ticked toward dawn, the revolution's greatest threat stirred not in distant capitals, but in the hearts of those closest to him. Sankara's day began with rituals that had become legend. He woke in the same military barracks he'd occupied since seizing power in 1983, refusing the presidential palace as a monument to stolen labor. His breakfast, a bowl of millet porridge shared with aides, doubled as a cabinet meeting. That morning, the talk turned to tensions within the National Council of the Revolution, CNR, the governing body of soldiers and intellectuals guiding Burkina Faso's transformation. Reports had surfaced of grumbling among junior officers about austerity measures, of whispered comparisons between Sankara's unyielding idealism and the pragmatism of his deputy, Blaise Compaoré. Revolution without discipline is noise, Sankara reminded them, wiping his bowl clean with a finger. But the unease lingered like the harmattan dust coating the windows. By midday, Sankara's schedule reflected his dual identity as soldier and philosopher. He inspected a textile factory where workers, emboldened by new profit-sharing laws, debated Marx during loom repairs. At a literacy class for market women, he laughed as a grandmother scolded him for the nonsense of phonetic Dula script. Yet even here, shadows trailed him. A young lieutenant assigned to his security detail avoided eye contact. A shopkeeper who once praised land reforms now muttered about city men dictating to farmers. These were not the signs of foreign conspiracies, but of fractures in the fragile alliance holding the revolution together, fractures that would soon split wide open. The crisis had been brewing for months, rooted in contradictions Sankara himself had sown. His vision demanded radical equality. Ministers' salaries slashed to match teachers' wages. Tribal chiefs stripped of feudal privileges. Every policy measured against its impact on the poorest. But in a nation where power had always flowed from the barrel of a gun, not all shared his ascetic zeal. Compaoré, once a brother in arms from their days as junior officers, had grown distant. Where Sankara saw corruption as a cancer to be burned out, Compaoré spoke of balancing ideals with reality. Their disagreements sharpened over the Revolutionary Military Organization, OMR, a watchdog group Sankara created to root out opportunists within the regime. When Compaoré's allies were accused of hoarding imported cars, Sankara ordered the vehicles torched in a public square, a spectacle that drew cheers from crowds, but sowed fury in the barracks. As Sankara headed to his 4 p.m. cabinet meeting that fateful day, the streets seemed alive with his vision. Peasant cooperatives unloaded sacks of locally grown cotton at state warehouses, bypassing the middlemen who once siphoned profits. School children in patched uniforms recited his slogan, "Produce what we consume what we produce," as they marched past murals depicting Burkina Faso's new heroes, farmers, nurses, and women with ballot slips in hand. But beneath this surface unity, old networks of patronage and military loyalty were stirring. The Conseil de l'Entente, the meeting hall where Sankara's inner circle gathered, had become a stage for a drama of betrayal written not by outsiders, but by men who once swore oaths to the revolution. The meeting began with routine reports. Aluna Traoré, just returned from a provincial tour, described villages where shared granaries had replaced hunger. Pauline Bamuni outlined plans for a CNR newspaper to counter defeatist rumors spreading in the markets. But the air thickened with unspoken tensions. Absent were key military commanders. Present was an unusual contingent of soldiers from the Régiment de la Sécurité Présidentielle, RSP, their crisp uniforms contrasting with Sankara's faded red joggers. When the president rose to speak about purging careerists masquerading as revolutionaries, a young RSP lieutenant near the door tightened his grip on his sidearm. What happened next unfolded with the grim logic of palace coups throughout history. As Sankara debated land reform, engines roared outside. The RSP soldiers, trained to protect the presidency, instead leveled their weapons at the man who personified it. In later years, survivors would struggle to reconcile the killers' identities. Captain Hyacintha Kafando, who'd once carried Sankara's briefcase. Sergeant Major Mahamadi Sawadogo, who taught the president's children to ride bicycles. These were not foreign mercenaries, but men who'd shared barracks, rations, and revolutionary songs. When Sankara stepped forward, hands raised, his final words were less about martyrdom than bewilderment. Why? What have I done to you? The answer lay in the revolution's own contradictions. For every Burkina who saw Sankara as a liberator, another saw a zealot dismantling traditions. Tribal leaders resented losing hereditary lands to peasant collectives. Black market traders chafed under strict import bans. Mid-ranking officers coveted the privileges Sankara denied them. Compaoré, long positioning himself as the reasonable alternative, had spent months forging alliances with these groups. His promises were simple: relax austerity, restore military perks, and end the CNR's humiliating audits of officers' finances. By the time Sankara realized the depth of the betrayal, the RSP's loyalty had already shifted. The coup's aftermath revealed a machinery of betrayal crafted entirely from domestic materials. State radio announced Sankara's death as the work of adventurists within our own ranks, a fiction maintained for years through carefully staged trials and doctored evidence. Compaoré's new regime released photos of Sankara's body clad in a Lacoste shirt and Rolex, items he'd famously despised, to paint him as a hypocrite. The truth, unearthed decades later, was more intimate. Sankara's corpse, hastily buried in a cotton sack, had been stripped of identity by the same hands that once saluted him. What makes this story uniquely devastating is how thoroughly internal the destruction was. The revolution wasn't toppled by outsiders, but by the complacency of those who'd benefited from it. Civil servants who'd applauded anti-corruption drives began skimming funds again, justifying it as reward for sacrifice. Farmers who'd received land titles sold them back to wealthy merchants. Even Sankara's famed bicycle, symbol of his humility, became a prop in Compaoré's propaganda, displayed in museums while the new president toured the capital in a Mercedes. Yet the revolution's ghost refused to die. In the 1990s, as Compaoré consolidated power, students smuggled taped recordings of Sankara's speeches into classrooms. Market women invoked his name during tax protests. The trial that finally exposed the coup's details in 2021, though flawed and incomplete, was driven not by international pressure but by a new generation of Burkinabés demanding accountability. Survivors like Aluna Traoré, who'd played dead beneath his comrades' bodies, became living bridges between eras. Their testimonies a reminder that revolutions are never destroyed, only neglected. Sankara's legacy today is a mirror held up to the nation he loved. The cotton fields he championed now supply textile mills owned by political elites. The literacy programs he launched are underfunded, but still producing poets who versify his downfall. Compaoré's eventual ouster in 2014, during protests led by teenagers who'd never known Sankara's era, proved the durability of ideas over individuals. When the crowd stormed Parliament, they didn't wave foreign flags. They sang old CNR anthems and carried banners demanding justice for Thomas. This is where the story transcends tragedy. Sankara's assassination wasn't just a coup. It was a collision between two visions of power, one that saw leadership as service, the other as entitlement. The weapons that killed him weren't smuggled across borders, but drawn from national armories. The lies that buried his legacy weren't crafted in distant embassies, but in the minds of men who'd sat at his table. And the reckoning, when it came, arose not from international courts, but from street vendors and school teachers who kept his memory alive through folk tales and protest songs. To you watching this, the activists, the idealists, the everyday heroes, Sankara's story offers no easy lessons. It doesn't villainize foreign boogeymen or romanticize struggle. Instead, it asks uncomfortable questions. How do we guard against the corruption of our own movements? Can we build systems that outlive our human flaws? Sankara's revolution failed not because his ideas were wrong, but because he underestimated how power, even when seized for noble ends, can corrode the bonds between comrades. As the sun sets over Ouagadougou today, farmers still pause at the sound of distant engines. Old women still debate whether Sankara was a saint or a fool. And in a quiet corner of the Dagnoan cemetery, where his remains were finally reburied, the epitaph reads simply, "Father of the Revolution." No foreign names, no grand conspiracies, just a nation's love and loss etched in stone. Your support through likes, shares, and super thanks helps us amplify these vital conversations. If this story moved you, consider joining our community of truth seekers. Together, we can ensure that history's silenced voices are heard. Drop a comment below. How do we prevent the ideals of today from becoming the betrayals of tomorrow? The revolution continues, not with guns, but with questions.